Hey, okay, so last week we painted these potted plants and we talked about light and shadow and why it's so important in our watercolor paintings, and I got this comment. This is great, but I can't see the light and shadow in my pictures well enough to portray it correctly in my paintings. I love that. Let's talk about it. So today we're going to do what's called a value study, and we're going to translate that into a color study. But first we have to talk about color value. What is color value? Color value is the lightness or darkness of a color. And in watercolor, we can achieve lightness of a color by adding water, and we can get a darker value of color by adding more paint. So it's pretty straightforward with watercolor. We need to add water or we need to add paint, depending on how dark we need the certain value of a color to be in a particular spot in our painting. Sometimes new artists are tempted to add white to get a lighter value of color or to add black to get a darker value of color, but that's not how it works with watercolor. All you need to do is add paint or add water. So let's do an exercise that will be really easy for you to do right now at home. Choose any color. I'm using French ultramarine blue, and pick up some of the paint with your brush and mix that a little bit with water on your palette. Now you're going to add as much water as you possibly can to get the lightest possible value of that color, and you're going to swipe it onto your paper. Then pick up a little bit more paint and put that in your puddle and put that on your paper. Slowly and surely pick up paint, mix it into your mixture, put it on the paper, and you will see on your paper the value of color is slowly getting darker and darker as you go. And then at the very end, you can take paint straight from the well and use that as your darkest value. This is what we call a value scale, and we're also going to do a more blended out value scale. So again, start with a lot of water, very light value of color at the bottom, and we are going to continue to add more paint to get darker values, but we're going to kind of blend it together on a bar of some kind. So it starts light, but it's blending together with our lighter values, medium values, and our darker values, and we can kind of see more of a realistic look of how all of the values interact with each other, especially with watercolor, because we are going to be blending a lot of colors and a lot of values together. So it's kind of fun to see if we can get a good representation of these values by blending them all together. And I lost a little bit of my lighter values towards the bottom, so after I did this darkest value, I rinsed my brush, dabbed it on my paper towel, and tried to even out the end a little bit so it was a little bit more equal in the lightness range. It's kind of tricky, but it's a really fun and I think worthwhile practice to try to create your own value scale. So the reason we went over color value first is that is how we create light and shadow. Our light colors are going to be the lightest values of color by adding water, and our darker shadows are going to be our darker values of color by adding more paint. So our first layers in watercolor need to be our most transparent, lightest values, and our last layers need to be our darkest, most opaque layers. Now before we paint our value study, back to the question, how do we see our lights and shadows? Well, my favorite way is to take a picture. I took this picture when we went up north recently, and to make it black and white. I can do this straight in my phone. You can do it in an editing app, but you'll go to the saturation and you'll completely decrease it until it is black and white. You can play with the contrast to make it a little bit more light and dark in certain areas. But this is how I'm able to take any picture that's in color and make it black and white so I can see the values without the color getting in the way. Sometimes the color gets in the way of us being able to tell where the light, medium, and dark values are. And now that we see those values, we are going to do what's called a value study. This is where we do a painting with just one color. I'm using Payne's Gray. It's a beautiful neutral tint. And we just focus on the lightness and darkness of that one color in that painting. So it's kind of like a pre-training of our eye before we have to use color to do the painting. We can focus on where areas are light, medium, and dark with just one color. It's kind of really freeing of your mind. You don't have to worry about color. Let's just worry about light and dark, adding water or adding paint. So for looking at our reference picture, obviously the very lightest part of our painting are those bright white poppies. So I pre-sketched the areas where I could see the poppies because I don't want to paint over them with any of my paint. They need to be very bright white. Now I can see that my second lightest value are a lot of these stems that are coming down from the poppy. They're pretty light, especially because up where I am taking the picture, there's a lot of light coming in from that direction. So I'm surrounding those poppies that I've sketched out with a lot of texture, with a lot of washes of this lighter Payne's gray paint in this very first layer of our lightest value of color. A lot of the first beginning stages of a watercolor painting look really weird because it's a lot of blobs and textures when we do those first layers of color. Because the first layers of color are like the base. It's not really outlining, we're not really painting anything yet. And then now here comes a slight tricky part. A lot of our light colors are really thin stems. So we need to now increase our value, but we need to paint around the stems. So this is a form of painting called negative painting, where we aren't painting the stems, we're painting around the stems to show the stems. So I'm making sure that I'm not losing the lightness where the stem is leaving the petals, the big head of the poppy, and I'm painting around the poppy. I'm adding more texture because I want lots of lines so that everywhere that I'm not painting this medium value looks like the line of a stem. And so I'm just not really thinking too much. I'm looking at my reference picture and just seeing where are the more medium values of color and where are we going to need to layer darker colors later, and I'm focusing my color on that. I'm also really focusing with this medium value of color on outlining the flowers and their stems so that we can get a better picture of where they are. I also want to make it clear, if it wasn't clear already, that my style is very loose. I'm a loose watercolor artist, and I don't take my interpretations of my reference pictures too seriously. They give me an idea of what I want to do, and if I want to do something different, I do something different, which is a lot of the time why I don't provide reference pictures, because I go off of them so often, but I do get asked very often to show reference pictures. So here's a reference picture. I'm not going to follow it completely. You can follow it better than me if you want to, but I'm mostly using it as a guide for color value. Now you can start to see our values are building. I can see my lightest values of color still, which is great. We do not want to lose them, because if we lose them with watercolor, we can't bring them back. I can see definitely a lot of medium value of color, which is great because that's a lot of our reference picture. But now we are starting to add more paint into our mixture, so we have an even darker color value. And with the darker color values, I'm trying to outline what I've already created as far as stems and texture, adding maybe more leafy texture. A little bit goes a long way with the darkest values. And then I'm kind of blobbing out some of the shadowy areas that I'm seeing in my reference picture as well, just to make the other areas that are lighter pop even more. We are going to finish our value study by adding some shadows to our flowers so that they have a little bit more dimension, and some darker details to the centers for the center of the flower. Even though in our reference picture we can't see very many of them, this is again my loose interpretation of the picture. Now that we have completed our value study, we are going to use it as a guide for our color study. We're going to paint the same thing but in color. But now that we know where the light, medium, and dark values are, we should be able to not be as distracted by color and really focus on the lightness or darkness of those colors. So often when we are painting something green, we go straight for green instead of thinking about how light that green needs to be to start. When I am painting a color study of something, especially something that's green that has a light source coming on it, I will typically pick up a yellow so that it has a little bit of a golden hue. But the great thing about using color for the base of our watercolor painting is I can use all kinds of different colors if I am still within the light value, which is honestly one of my favorite parts about watercolor. So in this bottom layer of light value, I'm going to add yellow, green, maybe really light blue. As long as I'm making sure that they're still light with lots of water, it can be considered the lightest value and I can use it for my base color. So we're going to put that all around, trying to do the same type of pattern that I did on the left. So it's really nice that I've already painted it because it feels like I know what I'm doing this time around with color, which is always really helpful because sometimes the color just really messes with your brain. But if we're focusing on the lightness versus the color, it helps us to see it clearly. So the colors I'm actually using, in case you're wondering, for this painting, I have cad yellow, I have yellow ochre, hooker's green, and indigo. For my lightest golden highlighted areas, I will be using a lot of the cad yellow and the yellow ochre. For my more middle values, I add in more green. And then when I get to my darker values of color, I start to add in the indigo for some cooler shadow tones. Again, remember that this base layer is not supposed to be necessarily very pretty. It just establishes the base color because we can't bring our lightness back with watercolor. We start with our lightness, we just need to get it on the paper, and then we can come through with our middle values of color. Like you see here, I have picked up a little bit more green, added a little bit of indigo to it to have it be a nicer, cooler green, and we can start adding some texture, some shape. We're going to make sure to add some of the stems by painting around them using the negative painting technique and just focusing on our reference picture, but also our value study to know where we're going to place this color. And as long as I'm focusing on middle values of color, it doesn't really matter what color I'm putting down. And I just wanted to say how cool it is that while I'm watching this back, that the left painting, the value study, looks like I've taken that portion of my screen and just made it black and white, and it is really freaking my eyes out. But I think value studies are beneficial for that alone. It's just so fun to look at a painting that is one color. Slowly but surely, we are continuing to add more color value, darker color value, onto our painting. Now, if you are like me and you like to paint loose watercolor style, my tip is to have some textured, detailed areas and then some areas that are more blobby. If everything is really textured, like if we tried to mimic the texture that we see in the reference picture, it would look so busy and so chaotic that it wouldn't be aesthetically pleasing anymore. So I'm trying to match the feeling of the reference picture by adding a lot of that texture that's represented in the stems and the leaves and everything that's going on with all of these wildflowers. But I am having some areas that are more one wash of color without texture. So it's okay to leave some of those blobby areas, especially if they're lighter, and then we can focus on the little details with our darker values of color. I also find that when I am doing a color study, I'm painting something with all of its real colors, I do more layers of paint. So I have my initial light wash, and then I try to go for a light to medium wash, and then I'm doing a medium wash, and then I'm doing a darker value wash, and then I go in with my darker details, and it just feels like I'm able to add more depth and nuance to the painting with color. And so I tend to do a little bit more layers of value color. Whereas on the left, I felt like I was able to accomplish the same exact thing with 3 very distinct layers of light, medium, and dark value of color. So it's just kind of interesting how it works that way because I felt like I was adding dark enough colors on the right side for the color study, and then it just didn't feel like it was dark enough yet, so I kept adding more and more layers. So don't let that throw you off if you experience the same thing. My favorite part of the painting, whether you're doing a value study or a color study, is the darkest contrasting color, because you see here I'm adding my darkest values, or at least one of my darkest values, and everything really starts to pop. It's when it feels like everything is really coming together. I've added indigo to the green mixture on my palette, and I'm really focusing on the value study that I created to the left to help me know where I put those deep shadow colors before, and I'm trying to mimic the feeling of those shadows. So a little bit less texture and a little bit more of that blobby wash to create the feeling of depth and shadows underneath where you're not seeing as much texture. And then we are again going to finish off our color study with the center of our flowers. I'm going to do kind of a lightish yellow green color for the shadows because there's so much greenery around these poppies. Some of the more realistic shadow colors would be light green, and then a little yellow for the pop in the center because they look pretty that way and I love it. Our color study is done, but I am going to recap while I finish off the centers. So we were able to take a reference picture, make it black and white so that we could see where the light and the shadows were, and create a value study based on the lightness and darkness of the colors we were seeing without having to worry about color. Then we were able to use that as a guide to actually create a color study and get better values in our colors now that we were actually working with color. Someone also said in my comments that value does all the work, but color gets all the credit, and that is so true. I need that on a sticker somewhere. I hope this was really helpful for you today and that you got a lot out of it as always, and I will see you all next time. Bye.